Good morning. We have concluded the Hemshech Ayin Beis as the Rebbe Rashab wrote it, and we're learning the source and background text from the Mittler Rebbe's Mimer, based on the Alter Rebbe's Mimer discourse, discussing essentially the dynamics of how we transform this world, including our world of microcosm within ourselves, our own selfish and egocentric animal soul, into experiencing transcendence and elevating beyond our own needs and our own survival to seek out and love with a fiery passion the divine. Put it in simple English. In the words of the prayer is that the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, the contemplation on the divine unity that permeates all of existence and is a unity that is seamless and all-encompassing, that in turn affects, that's the contemplation of the divine soul, that in turn affects the animal soul, and to the point that it also arouses and awakens, stimulates within it, instead of loving itself, to love a higher reality, to put it in different terms, a higher state of consciousness. So that's the process, what we call Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the soul of a human being is compared to a flame or candle. Candle consists of three things: a wick, which is the divine soul that immerses itself, and that enters within the oil, which is the animal soul's intelligence, to turn it from the oil shall become fuel, to fuel the fire. Is the third dimension, that light, the divine light and fire, fiery passion of Ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, loving God, b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, with both sides of the heart, which includes both the divine soul and the animal soul. That's the pure. That's the discussion as far as a soul goes, and its initiative, its actions, its work toward achieving this higher state of consciousness. But now we have another verse, Ner mitzvah v'Torah that a mitzvah is also compared to a candle. And the question that the Mittler Rebbe, as he posed it, is, what does that come to add? And I'm reading now, summing up what we learned yesterday, page 390 through middle of 392. So he asked the question, what's the connection between an actionable good deed, which is a mitzvah, to a ner, to a candle? And he continues to explain that a candle too has these three elements. The wick, which he says, well, he begins with the light. The light that creates is the light of Torah, is the divine light that it generates. And how is that done? By taking physical objects, which is the shemen. Just like we spoke about the animal soul in the first, in explaining how the soul has all three, has the candle of the connected to the soul, that the animal soul is like the oil, the intelligence of human intelligence of this world. So here shemen refers to the physical objects to which a mitzvah is done, and the psila is the connector between the divine light of Torah, of God's light, and the physical items which the mitzvah is done with. So the psila is the neshama that performs the mitzvahs, so and that causes the shemen to be drawn into the wick, which in turn gets consumed and fuels the divine fire. And he said it briefly. He said, we'll explain this. He'll explain it later. Okay. And that's a shemen al reishech leyechser. These are the good deeds that radiate and illuminate a soul. Right. Like he said, when a person does mitzvahs, it increases vitality. V'chai b'hem, it adds a vitality into the soul. So what we see here, briefly at least, is the contribution of a mitzvah over the neshama itself. The neshama also has divine connection, obviously, because it's a divine entity. But with a mitzvah, it draws down even more chayus, energy, because it's God's mitzvah. So by doing good deeds, in other words, in simple English, every soul is a good soul, is a divine soul. But if a person lives their life only with the divine soul, never does any good actions, just hypothetically, so the soul remains a more of a dormant and latent state within the person. When you do a good deed, what's happening is you're bringing alive the soul in action through the good deeds. So mitzvahs are actualizing the soul's power. Now, we're going to learn about this more as we go on, but that's briefly what he's saying right now. And that's why it's shemen al reshach. It's like the shemen, a tev al resh, that radiates and elevates it and illuminates it, like in a form what he calls makif al gabe haresh. Okay. So that's the addition of the mitzvah over the neshama. Now, to explain this, he says, we have to understand where the Maisa mitzvahs, why do actions have this power? A soul is itself a divine entity. How do actions, especially with physical objects, which seems to be a lower level of spirituality because it's manifesting in the physical actions of good deeds, of mitzvahs, how does that have the ability, the power, how does that have the power to increase energy, and even a new energy, an unprecedented one, in the divine soul? So to explain that, goes deeper into what a mitzvah is. Before I continue, I'm going to sum up what we learned, but I just wanted to show you how the Mittler Rebbe, you can see very openly and very clearly here how the Bina of the Mittler Rebbe adds to the Chachma of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, when he talks about this in the Maimer we learned in Torah Eir, just going to read a few lines, and you'll see how the Mittler Rebbe is unpacking it over a few pages. So if you go to Torah Eir, I'm reading specifically on page 38C, or in the numbers it's page 76. This is the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe we learned before we learned the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. We learned this inside. So after explaining what a soul is, just a second. Okay. So in the Torah Eir that we just, and so he says, after explaining Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, what I just summed up, the soul, then he goes, it says, Ner Shel HaMitzvah, Hisha Mitzvah Yezos Gula Pratis. He says that a mitzvah has a particular feature, a unique feature, specific feature, Lahalis Es Nefesh Habamis. I'm reading inside, to elevate the animal soul. Now we learned before that the Shema is meant to lead to V'ahavtas Hashem L'kecha and also elevates the animal soul. Yet a mitzvah adds something. And you see the Alter Rebbe is already beginning to discuss it. So I want to just read it in the Alter Rebbe's language and then show you how the Mittler Rebbe, as I said, elaborates. Well, the Kasher Be'erein Soy Baruch Hu, and to bind that animal soul to Erein Soy Baruch Hu, to divine infinite light. Kamaimer, and here's what he brings: Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvesov. Like when we say in the blessing before we say a mitzvah, Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvesov, you sanctified us with the one Baruch Atah Hashem L'keinu, the one that sanctified us. God sanctified us with His mitzvahs. And he says right away, but Kedush ha'elyon shu l'mayla min ha'ishtalshelus. He sanctifies with kedusha. What is the addition Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvesov? He could have just said He commanded us. Why do we have to say He sanctified us? Clearly, that means the mitzvahs add something that we would not have in our own. And what is the addition? The Kedushanu is a Hemshech, a transmission from a very lofty and very sublime and level called Kedush ha'elyon, Shulamayla min ishtalshelus. That's higher than ishtalshelus. And then he goes on to explain how that works, that the mitzvahs are levushim. Just that one line is what the Rebbe, Alter Mittler Rebbe, is here unpacking in detail. So what does that mean? Kedush ha'elyon l'mayla min ishtalshelus. So that's what we learned yesterday, and I'm going to sum it up now, which is an explanation of that line from the Alter Rebbe. That there's many levels of Kedusha. like he brings from the Zohar. Tama Kedushin Eloin, like he says. So I'm just going to, I'm not going to read the whole thing inside. I'm just summing up what we learned. Mitzvos nikle b'shem kodesh, k'moshano emrim, aksher kedushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu. And the Mitzvah Rebbe adds, like it says in a number of places. So that one line from the Alter Rebbe, all this is coming to explain that one line. What does it mean that a mitzvah has a unique power to introduce, to elevate the animal soul through the kedusha that it brings? So he says, "Ubchinas kedusha zu dahin kedusha yena b'yesa shalamaylam b'chos kedusha salayenis." So that one line, the Alter Rebbe says that it's a kedusha higher than ishtalshlus. The Mitzvah Rebbe explains that there's levels of kedusha, and this is the highest level, and it's called Kedush Elyon. That's the words that the Alter Rebbe uses. Kedush Elyon. Yeah, the is a Kedush Elyon. And in Zohar he says it's called Kedush Kodesh Ilah, the Kodesh Mila B'Garmei, like I explained yesterday. It's completely removed. Like it says in Zohar that there's many levels, comic levels of Kedusha. But then the Aval Ein Kodesh Kavaya, then there's a level that's higher and removed from all of them. So what did we learn? That there's a Kedusha Atzmus Bereishis that's completely removed. It's not relative to existence. You can have a level of Kedusha relative to Chayil, to the mundane, it's holy. But then you can have a level of Kedusha that's relative. That's what he's going to call a Kedusha Seder Ishtalshlus. But Kedusha Atzmus Bereishis Shalamayla Mayla Makol Ikur Mokara Ishtalshlus. What the Alter Rebbe just said with Shalamayla Ishtalshlus, here he says with more words, Shalamayla Mayla Makol Ikur Mokara Ishtalshlus, to save Mamala Abya. So even though you have in Ishtalshlus levels that are Kodesh and Muvdal, in the level of Makif and Merumah and Masnasa, that's the general level of Sevav Kalaman. Sevav Kalaman, for example, compared to Mamala Kalaman, is Kodesh and Muvdal. Mamala Kalaman is the divine Koyach HaPoel Benifel, the divine energy within existence. And Sevav is the divine energy beyond existence. But it's relative. And that's Kedusha, Legabe Erech Ishtalshlus, HaMesnasi Meselam. And he compared it to Chachma. Chachma is also called Kodesh, the Yud of Shem Havaya, but that's Chachma as it relates to existence, because Chachma brings Kulam b'Chachma Sisa, everything was created with Chachma. So Chachma is Kedusha, Kaddish, or compared to Ishtalshlus. So it's the Ayin, Chachma Ma'ayin to Matzah, but it's the Ayin of the Yesh Ma'ayin. So the Yesh of existence came from this Ayin. So even though the Ayin is removed, that's why it's called Ayin. It's a state beyond the Yesh. The Yesh can't comprehend it, can't relate to it. But it's still the Ayin of the Yesh Anivra, like he says. And he calls, like the Mayon and the Nar, the spring of water, which is beneath the ground, you don't see it, it's only drops, but from there comes the river. So even though there's a level of being removed, but it's still relative to each other. So even though it's nevertheless, it's like Makif Legabe Pnimi. But the Mechol Mokim Shaykh Rak Legabe Ishtalshlus. All this is the Kedusha within Ishtalshlus. So in Ishtalshlus itself, you have levels, one higher than the other, one more removed than the other. Then he continues and said that this is what the Zohar says, the levels of Kedusha also refer to levels of Chachma. Since Chachma is called Kedusha, Kadesh, so therefore there's Chachma of Atzilus and there's Chachma of Bria, of Yitzir and Asiya, and they're all rooted to the Makar of Chachma and Atzilus, Abba. However, this is all Das Tachten, the Ayin of the Yesh of the creation. But Aval B'chinas Kadesh Elyon, Hainu B'chinas Kedusha Atzmus Mamish. This is already a Kedusha that is not relative, fundamentally removed completely. Shalamayla Shenivdelis Be'erech Legamri, Afilim B'chinas Kedusha the Seva Mamala. So it's removed even from the levels of Kedusha in Ishtalshlus, even from the Seva in relation to Mamala. Because Shaloya Taken Lemer, on this level, you can't say, in Seva Klam, you could say it's removed. Here, you can't even say that it's removed. It's completely not in that realm. Loya Taken Lemer, like he says, it's not even the realm of being a source for existence. It's completely the divine as it stands on its own beyond any form of existence. Similar to what we learned, well, not similar, the levels we learned of the ayin of the Yesh Amiti, where there it's a divine, simply, he wants to express himself. It's not how godly energy is relating to existence. It's the godly energy is completely removed. It's the Atzmus of Elikus, the way it is on its own, without yet being directed toward creation of existence. Before there was the tzimtzum that would bring it to become the Ratzon Hashem and Ratzon HaChachmah, and this is the level of Das Elyon, that's complete bittul mitzias, that even Keser, Sach, even the highest level of is darkened, is like darkness, like black, compared to this level. That's how distant and removed it is. And though it's Gamze who b'chinas primi is Atzmus shlei mamish and nikla Kedusha Atzmus mamish. As I explained yesterday, it's referring to the It is an what the Rebbe Rashab called the that's revealed for himself, not the as he is revealed through create existence, the second level of Ayin, the high level of Ayin. And this is what we talk about, what a mitzvah is able to accomplish. The mitzvah is bringing from that Kodesh Elyon. Since a mitzvah is the channel that conveys and that expresses God's higher will. In other words, Hishtalshlus is like I've talked many times the example. Hishtalshlus is the structure. You want to build a house for your family. So the family is the main point, is the end. The means is you build a house. The Ratzon in the house, even though there are levels of Kedusha here, but it's all part of a stepping stone, meaning it's a means to an end. What's the end? The end is for the neshama to come into the house, into this building, and transform it into a dira b'tachteinu. So the Ratzon, therefore, of mitzvahs is higher than the Ratzon for existence. Existence is the place where the mitzvahs are being done. But the mitzvah itself is what God wants. It's his Ratzon to take the physical world, to take the parchment, to make it into a holy sacrament like to Sefer Torah or Tefillin or Mezuzah, to take wool and turn it into tzitzis, to take a lulav and esrog and turning it into a mitzvah of Sukkah's the dal minim. And the same thing, all the physical things that we take in this world, those physical things are created by the divine energy that relates to existence. But the mitzvah comes and manifests not just the creation of existence, that which is beyond existence, to transform existence. And that's this Eira Atzmus. It was Primis Atzmus, Kedusha Atzmus Mamish. This is the inner reason why God created the world. This is his inner Ratzon, reflecting, well, besides being the inner desire of creation, it's also Primis Tzene, it reflects what God really wants. He wants these mitzvahs, Shemeir behem b'chinas Primis Atzmusei, Shub'chinas Ensof Mamish, like it says, Rechava, Rechava mitzvah sechem eid bli gvul mamish. So mitzvahs, you say, have that expansiveness and have that power. So there's the creation itself, which is through the divine energy of Sevav and Mamala Seder Ishtalshlus. There you have levels of Kedusha. And then there's the Kedusha Lamaila Mishtalshlus. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, we say, Asher Kedishonu b'mitzvah. That only happens through a mitzvah. The world itself relates to the divine energy that relates to the world. So even though it's removed to some extent, but it's not fundamentally coming from the highest levels of the divine. Whereas a mitzvah does draw down from the highest levels of Elikus. Now, as I said, we're far from finished the subject because we still have to understand. So what would a neshama be like without the mitzvah? We did learn the neshama originates also from these highest levels. That's why a neshama can come down and transform the world, because it's beyond existence. But clearly the mitzvah is helping the neshama do this, because the mitzvahs are God's ratzon, and basically are the instruments that the neshama uses to transform the world. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but I just wanted to make sure that we understand that he's coming to explain what mitzvahs come to add, the ner mitzvah that adds to the ner Hashem nishma soda.
Because the mitzvahs are in Gashmias.
That's number one. And the mitzvah also is, like I said, when you say Shema Yisrael, he said Yisrael is all about machshava. It's also rooted at the highest. But to really bring out the neshama's powers, it needs instruments. It needs like tools. So the mitzvahs manifest in Gashmis, but they also are God's way. Like I mentioned yesterday, you could be what they say a Jew at heart. You could have a neshama and be all on the highest level of a soul, but if you don't act on it, if a person doesn't do a mitzvah, they're not actualizing the power of the soul. So we'll talk about this because Shema Yisrael is also a mitzvah. However, here he's talking about also all the mitzvahs, and as I said, we shall discuss what the mitzvah said. But meanwhile, that's what he said, explaining what a mitzvah comes to add, Asher Kedushanu of the mitzvah, the Kodesh. So how do you pronounce it when you say the highest level? Kodesh Elyon or Kadosh Elyon? Or Kodesh Elyon? I think Kodesh, not Kodesh, because Kodesh is already Kodesh, with the Vav before the Daled, right?
Yeah. Or even without the Vav. I think that without the Vav is
like Kadesh. So you could say Kadesh Elyon?
No, Kodesh. It depends. You could make it with a Vav or without a Vav. If without a Vav, it's higher.
No, of course. That's why it's Milah Begarmei, right? When you say Kodesh, you're already saying, yeah. Even though he does say Ein Kodesh Kavaya, not Ein Kedesh Kavaya. Okay. Because that's comparing it to the lower levels of Kedusha. So that's where we stopped, and that's where I will continue. Does anyone want to ask anything about what we've learned so far? As I said, there's more coming, so not over yet. So he's continuing to develop now the idea, as I said, all based on that few lines of the Alter Rebbe. And we'll soon see how he continues to take the Alter Rebbe, continues to discuss it as well. But this piece, everything we've learned here is an explanation of that meaning. What means that mitzvahs are Kedush Elyon, which is L'mayla min Ishtalshus. So that we established. But he's going to continue in the parentheses. He adds to basically to establish further this exalted state of a mitzvah. And just to drive the point home, let me just add something. In other words, we're talking Asher Kedushanu Mitzvos V'Tzivanu is God commanding us to do mitzvahs. We're not talking now about someone who's behaving morally based on their own common sense. Because the concept, before Matan Torah, they also had people who were behaving in Chesed and Tzedakah and so on. But Avram Avinu. But there's a concept of Mitzvah V'Eiser, that by Matan Torah they were commanded by Hashem. That's why the Rambam says, for example, even bris, even though we do a bris, we say bris shel Avram Avinu. Shenichnas bebris shel Avram Avinu. So it's the bris because Avram was commanded. Yet the Rambam writes in Pirush HaMishnayos in Chulin that when we do a mitzvah bris, is not because Avram did it. It's because by Matan Torah we were given this mitzvah. And the Rebbe explains in a very powerful sikha in Chelik Yud Likutei Sichos. So why do we say bris shel Avram Avinu by a bris? He says because the bris shel Avram Avinu invokes the schus of Avram that obviously pioneered the path. But the mitzvah, the power of bringing Kedusha into this physical world, even though Avram was given that power as well, by Matan Torah was a whole different level of Kedusha, like he's saying here. So the idea that you're given a mitzvah, Hashem says, I'm giving you my commandments. So in other words, Lo Sitzach, for example, you could say a person can understand on their own, not to kill, not to steal, Lo Signev. But when it says a mitzvah, then you get that Hemshech that's coming. This is God's desire. It happens to be a desire that makes sense. There are mitzvahs that are chukim, that are beyond, super rational. There are mitzvahs that are edus. But even mishpatim, even the mitzvahs that we just read about in the last Shabbos, that mishpatim is still mitzvahs because Hashem gave them. However, some mitzvahs also manifest and are mislabish in tam v'das, in logical reasons. It's also explained the other way around, that even chukim also can be explained to some extent. But in essence, they're all Ratzon Elyon, and that's what, so when the Melech, in this case, Melech Malcham Malcham HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says, I am giving you my mitzvah, as they're soon going to say, it's called God's mitzvahs, he's giving us a power to elevate beyond what a human can elevate on their own strength. Because now they're connecting to the mitzvah that's giving that higher level of Kedusha that he's mentioning, Asher Kedushanu, which is why we say Asher Kedushanu Mitzvos V'Tzivanu. We don't just say, I'm doing it because it makes sense. This is because you sanctified me with these mitzvahs, because Hashem, he sanctified us with these mitzvahs. So to further make the case for that, he says, V'nikra, the parentheses, in the middle of page 392, the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. These mitzvahs are also called in Zohar, this is an expression from Zohar, Archin de Galgalta, Urches Havaya. Okay, so there's in the pasuk it says Urches Havaya, I believe, is in Tehillim. So the Zohar says, so Urches Havaya means the paths of God, referring to mitzvahs, that the mitzvahs are paths of God, divine paths. So they're divine. So the Zohar says, what is that referring to? So it's referring to a very high level in the spheres, which is called Orchin de Galgalta, the paths of the skull. So let me explain. We know that the human beings created in the divine image. So just like we have 10 faculties, our 10 faculties evolve from the 10 divine attributes. Chochmah, Bina, Das, all the way through Malchus. But then there's a level called Rotzen, Keser. Keser is associated not with the Meichin, it's with the skull that's above the Meichin, it's Makif. The skull surrounds the brain. So in Ruchnius, in spiritual levels, it's called Galgalta. Galgalta is a higher level that is beyond the 10 conscious spheres, the 10 conscious or the immanent faculties. In Galgalta itself, there are paths. The paths of the Galgalta means the different element, the structural elements of the Galgalta. So we say, when you say this Taryag Mitzvahs, is Taryag Urchin is the 613 paths of that level called the skull. So not a physical skull, obviously. We're talking about a level that's beyond the structure. I know you could say the question, didn't he say before that mitzvahs associated with Kedush Elyon, which is higher than Ishtalshus, even higher than Makif? So we'll address that shortly. Let me just see how he explains it. So he's calling it Archin de Galgalta, Orches Havaya, which is the level Shebebchinis Pnimis HaAtzmus. Like he said, this is Pnimis and Atzmus of Kedusha, not the Kedushas of Chochmah, for instance. This is higher, this is Galgalta. Now here again, seems to be somewhat hard to figure out all the parentheses, because we did just one parenthesis. Now he starts another parenthesis. In the parentheses comes a bracket. In the bracket comes the end of a parenthesis. So as I said, I'm not sure how to make heads and tails of this. I'm trying to figure it out because it seems to be a certain style. But regardless, we'll just read it as one flow, and then I'll try to figure out, if I can, what the parentheses are. So Kamosha Kosav, and he brings up proof to this, like it says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu maniach tefillin. Okay. So we know all the mitzvahs we do, Hashem also does. So in other words, this is adding another thing, that what you could say the mitzvahs are given to us. They're Hashem's rotzen. But the fact that Hashem does the mitzvahs, like it says, Magid Dvarav L'Yakov Chukov and Mishpatav L'Yisrael. Why is it Magid Dvarav L'Yakov Chukov Mishpatav? So the Medrash says, because Mashu Mitzav L'Acherim L'Ases Hu Yaseh. He does what he commands others to do. No, the fact that he's commanding us a mitzvah, Hashem does every mitzvah that we are given. So it's also Hashem's mitzvahs. So it comes to tefillin. It means just as we put on tefillin, Hashem puts on tefillin. But then the Gemara asks the question, what does it say in Hashem's tefillin? The tefillin, the Mora Alma, Maksiv Bahu. In our tefillin, it says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, because we need to be reminded, and we bind our mind and our heart to the Akdus Hashem of Shema Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. But Hashem does not need to be told, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem does not need to be reminded Hashem Echad. So the Gemara asks, what does it say in his tefillin? So he doesn't answer here, but the Gemara answers, it says, Mi ka'amchi Yisrael, goy echad ba'aretz. Hashem is reminded of how great, how unique. What kind of nation is this? Like the nation of Israel, a singular, unique nation on earth. But the point that he wants to bring here is really not so much what it says in the film, the idea that this is Hashem doing the mitzvah, just as we do the mitzvah. And the same thing, umesatev b'tzitzis. The Eibishter also wraps himself with tzitzis. Just like there's the mitzvah of tzitzis, tefillin, talis and tzitzis. He wraps himself with tzitzis. How do we know? He wraps himself with light. That's talking about Hashem, kisalma, like a shirt, like a beged, like a garment. Ukahai gavna, and similar. So all this is coming to tell us that Hashem, the mitzvahs associate with Hashem himself. They're not just given for us. Hashem himself, these mitzvahs are God's mitzvahs. If you ask me right initially, I would say the first parenthesis has to end before the second one. There's Atzmus, end of the parentheses, and the second parenthesis begins. That's what makes sense to me. But I'm not sure. I'm just pointing that out. Now comes a bracket. Now, brackets usually here come from a second manuscript. The parentheses are not second manuscript. They're part of the original manuscript. But the brackets here, now remember, this is not the Mittler Rebbe's original writing. We don't have his original Guf Saviat Kedush. We have Maitikim, people who copied it. So that's why that explains different. So the brackets comes to add. That's why the mitzvahs are called Mitzvei Sov. Asher Kedushanu b'Mitzvei Sov. We don't just call them mitzvahs. That God sanctified us with mitzvahs, with His mitzvahs. Key emphasis here. Mamish, mitzvahs and mamish. V'zeu shenikra Kedushas HaAtzmus mamish. And this is what is called the very Kedusha of Atzmus itself. 1 second. Somebody wants to ask something. Give me, let me finish, and then I'll stop for questions. Hold on. This is why it's called Mitzvah Sov, Kedushas HaAtzmus, and there's a parenthesis again in the bracket. Mamish the Kedusha of Atzmus. So the end of the parentheses is not clear where that began. Where did it begin? So is it the end of the parentheses, and then the bracket continues? Not so clear. But regardless, so it's a very important key. Kedushas HaAtzmus mamish. It's the Mittler Rebbe's original expression based on the Alter Rebbe. Kedushas HaAtzmus mamish. You're talking about not Kedusha of Atzmus, not Kedusha in Nishtalshlus, in lower levels. And that's what we say in Birchas HaMitzvos. When we make a blessing on mitzvahs, we say Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvaysav. That you are Mekadosh us, you sanctify us with your mitzvahs from Kedushas HaAtzmus. Sheheim b'chinas makifim leguf. What is this, a Yechudi law? Not sure.
A Yichud Elyon, maybe.
Yeah. Yichud Elyon, maybe. Yeah. It's a little. It's a language he hasn't used till now. I'm just thinking a second. 1 second. I'm looking below if they write anything about this. Let's see.
Well, it makes sense that the mitzvahs are bringing into the body.
Yeah, that's not the question.
Level.
Of course, it makes sense, but he hasn't used it till now, and it's not a common expression. So I want to make sure. I'm not saying we can't say it's Yichud Elyon. I'm just thinking whether it could mean something else. Let me just think a second. The Alter Rebbe, 1 second, he talks about this also. Okay, we'll go with Yichud Elyon. That's what makes most sense here. So what he's saying is, that's what we say in Birchas HaMitzvos. Shehem b'chinas makifim l'gufa Yichud Elyon sheb'maisa mitzvahs. So essentially what he's saying here is, besides the fact that mitzvahs are a form of makif, which we're going to learn about, the Birchas HaMitzvos, that's what it seems like he's saying. So there's the mitzvah is the Yichud Elyon that it creates. When you do a Maisa mitzvah, there's a certain higher unity that you're achieving. And the Birchas HaMitzvos, which is Asher Kedushanu b'Mitzvaysav, is B'chinas makifim legufa yichud elyon. I would definitely want to look this up a little more because I don't recall offhand this concept that there's the gufa yichud elyon, which is the very yichud that the mitzvah does, and what the bracha adds, asher kedushan mitzvah. But it sure sounds like that the bracha is adding hamshach of the kedusha of the makif, which is higher, like he said before, the makif of orchen de golgalta. And ultimately, it's the pnimius atzmus that's even higher than makifim, meaning higher than the makifim of ishtalshlus. You have to say that. Okay, and with that he ends the bracket. Let me see if I see an end of a parenthesis here. Yeah, there's an end of a parenthesis, the end of the paragraph. No, but that's another parenthesis. Sorry. No, that's the problem here. Some of these parentheses never end, so I'm not sure. So we have another one to account for. Unless the ending of that is middle of the bracket, it would be very strange. Well, not very. Maybe that's the case. Okay, just talking to myself.
Why in Ayin Beis you had parentheses that lasted hundreds of pages?
Yeah, but it ends. There's a place where you actually see an end. Here, it's not the case. It's not. This is not lasting any page. This is all this section. This is more of a manuscript issue. Either the one who copied it, missed a parentheses or added a parentheses, or the printer made a mistake when they typeset it. You know, if I had the actual handwriting of the Mittler Rebbe, I could look it up and see what the Mittler Rebbe did. I don't think we have for this mimer. I have to look up where there is a mimer, where there's a Guf Saviat Kedush. That would be the best if we could find it in the original handwriting. But it's not. It doesn't change much because we need to read it anyway. And so we're reading it in one flow. It just happens to be, but it would be more organized if we knew exactly where each one ended. I'll have to give it some more thought because I have to give thought. If the parentheses outside of the bracket ends inside the bracket, so how are you supposed to read the other half of the bracket? That's the question I'm having here. So in other words, and it's a second manuscript. So there's a lot of, I'm a little confused here how these brackets work exactly. But regardless, what we've established here so far, just to sum up, because a lot of details here. So we established that the Kedusha, the Mitzvos are connected to Kedusha Elyon, the highest level, that's higher than Ishtalshus altogether. What he calls Pnimis Atzmus Ein Sof, he called Kedushas Atzmus Mamish. And that's what we draw down when we do a mitzvah. What is that he calls? That is what is called in the Zohar Orchen de Galgalta, the paths of the skull. I know it sounds strange, but it's the paths of God and Pnimis Atzmus. He added that this also connects to the fact that God does mitzvahs, maniach tefillin, misativ betzitzis. So Hashem Himself. So you see that the mitzvah is associated with God Himself. Not just with Hishtalshus and not just with Neshamas as they come down below. They are rooted all the way in the highest levels of Elikus. And that's why it's called Mitzvos of Mamish, Mitzvos of Kedusha Atzmus Mamish. And this is what we say, Asher Kedushan, B'Birchas HaMitzvos, which is the Hamshach of these Makifim over the very good Yichud Elyon that the mitzvahs themselves accomplish. That sums up what we just learned. I'll stop here if anybody wants to clarify, ask anything, and then we'll continue trudging our way through this. Yeah.
Why are you thinking
that?
What's that? There are three people here. Let's start with one. Who wants to begin first? There's Rav Shlomo, there's three, and I heard Yitzchak. So
I should get Reb Shlomo. He knows a lot more than me, and he's a couple months older than me. But what I just don't understand what Pnimis Atzmos. Atzmos is. It's like it's undefinable, unsplitting up, and also we have a Pnimius Atzmus.
We've used this term many, many times in Ayin Beis, where the expression goes usually together. Pnimius ve'atzmus. It's not separate things. It's saying there's outer expressions of Kedusha, which should be chitzenius, so to speak. Doesn't use that word. Pnimius means the inner and the core. That's how I would translate Pnimius and Atzmus, the inner and the core of Ein Sof, in contrast to the outer dimensions and the more external dimensions that manifest in Ishtalshlus. So that's an expression used often in Chassidus, Pnimis and Atzmus. It's just two terms. Atzmus is deeper than Pnimis, But you could combine them in general terms, in context. It means the inner core of your soul as opposed to the outer expression of it, for example. So you say the inner core, the inner and the core. That's essentially how I would translate it. He actually does say pnimius va'atzmis, and sometimes he says, here says pnimius va'atzmus shalei, and then he says pnimius atzmusei. It's true. Sometimes he's with a vav, sometimes without a vav. So it's either the inner of the Atzmus or it's the inner and the core. The inner of the core. So in the core itself, you could have an inner and an outer.
Yeah, with the vav I can understand it, but without the vav I can't understand it.
Well, without the vav means it's the inner of the core as opposed to maybe an outer expression of the core. But anyway, go ahead. Next question.
Okay. Why are you saying that this is not the Mitzvah Rebbe himself, but Semitic?
Simply because I did some research on that. I'm almost sure it's that. And that's why there are brackets. The brackets, if you look in the beginning of the Maimer, if you look on page 361 in the footnote, you'll see he says Nimsa bebuch. That this Maimer is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 12 different versions of this Maimer is found in Matikim. So that makes it very clear that he's bringing it from different. A Maitik was someone who copied it from the original. So the Mitzvah Rebbe would give it to someone who would copy it, and then many copies were made from that copy. So you can imagine mistakes could happen. So I see from the way the footnote that this is taken from all these copies. They're Hanochas, basically. The truth is, it may not even be. I have to check if this is Hanocha. This may even be something Mitzvah Rebbe never wrote. Maybe it's only what they heard. That I'm not sure about. Let me see here. Because they write, Teres Admur. Teres Admur. So it's very possible, let me see. It's very possible this Maimer was just delivered by the Mitzvah Rebbe and he didn't write it down. So then these 12 versions are 12 different ways that people wrote it down. Probably one wrote it and the others copied it. So that's why they write if you look at the footnote there, listen, you have to be a little involved in the publishing. I was very involved to know the rules. But bottom line, it's clearly not a Guf Seviat Kedush. It's not the Mitzvah Rebbe's original writing. It's his Maimer. He said it. Maybe he wrote it and we don't have a copy of what he wrote, or maybe he didn't write it. I'm just throwing out all the options here. But clearly what we have here has versions. And that's the brackets. And they say, look close, they say clearly that HaMaimer Nitvis Mebuch Aleph, the Maimer printed here is from the first version. Ubein Arichayim, between brackets, was added words from version 2 and version 6. That's what the publisher writes here. So that's how I know. Okay.
Okay, another thing, I know we spoke already about it, but he's saying, V'zeu shenikro Kedushas HaAtzmus Mamesh. So I know we spoke about it. You said that it's not talking about the Atzmus, it's talking about the Ein Sof, but it's not clear.
I don't know what you mean by Atzmus. The Rebbe Rashab says that when you say the word Atzmus, you don't mean Atzmus because you can't talk about Atzmus. You mean Ein Sof. You for some reason, you think you're talking about Atzmus. You're not talking about Atzmus. You're talking about Atzmus as it comes in language. You look it up in the Teira Shalom I quoted yesterday when you asked me this. In Teira Shalom, he says it beferish. Then we talk about. So the truth is, maybe we never talk about Atzmus because anything we say is already a step away from it by merely talking about it. But Ein Sof that we're talking about is, for all practical purposes, everything you know about Atzmus is this level. For some reason, I'm not sure. You're talking here mechanically. You're not experiencing Atzmus, right? You're talking about it as a level. You want to figure out which level it is. So, for me, sometimes Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, all of it is called Atzmus. Because Lifnei Tzimtzum is a level that's completely Atzmistic. It's just that Chassidus spoiled us and talks about the levels in before the Tzimtzum itself. But in truth, there were times, the Alter Rebbe called Atzilus, they called it, the Rebbe study called Atzilus. You know that. It says in Hayem Yem, I think. The Eibishter. You would think the Eibishter is Atzmus, right? But he called it Atzilus. So I think when you're really living these, experiencing these levels, it's not an academic discussion which level it is exactly. My understanding is the following, that Atzmus is something you can't really talk about, and it's something that we can try to extrapolate and try to figure it out, but here clearly it's talking about the Eid of Atzmus, and the Eid of Atzmus is just like Atzmus for all practical purposes, Kadam Kikad and other expressions. I would look up the Teda Shalom and study it there. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is a very fundamental concept in Chassidus B'chlal, that when we talk about Atzmus, we're usually talking about the expression of Atzmus. Even though there is the concept of Atzmus built in Mitzias Nimtza and a few other expressions that relate to those levels, but for all practical purposes, I would say that when you talk about Atzmus, unless you can tell me the difference between Eid of Atzmus Ha'er and Atzmus Mamish, I don't know if there's much difference.
The bottom line is that everyone knows that that every Yid is Negeya to Atzmus. It's a major difference if you say Negeya to Atzmus or to the Oyer Atzmus. It's a major.
Why don't you tell me this major difference? I'd like to hear it in simple English.
Because the only entity is Atzmus.
But Oyer of Atzmus doesn't have any entity of its own. 1 second. The Oyer of Atzmus is completely like Atzmus. This Oyer of Atzmus is not separate. Hayahu Shmei Bilvad. Is even Shmei is Hayahu Shmei Bilvad, but Oyer even higher. Oyer Hakol Batzmusei, or what we call Etzem Oyer. Anyway, why don't you read the Teda Shalom inside? Why don't you, one second, instead of debating this, why don't you open up the Teda Shalom? I'll tell you where it is, and read it yourself, and then we'll talk about it.
The Teda Shalom that found.
Teda Shalom from the Rebbe Rashab. You want to know the page?
The one that we learned?
I think it's there. If I'm almost sure it's there, or maybe not. Let me see. I would suggest reading the Teda Shalom. I'm almost sure we read it. I definitely brought it many times. But while I look, let's go to any other questions. Anybody? No? Okay.
Yes, I'm having a hard time, and this is maybe a digression, but a hard time understanding the notion of the Eberster doing the mitzvahs himself. There's many issues there, but one is if the mitzvahs are derived from this pneumius of Atzmus, then it seems to be in tension with the idea of the mitzvahs being an expression of godliness. I mean, you're doing something outwardly, right? We're to pick a mitzvah, and even Shema, you say it aloud, right? And yet we're talking about pneumius of Atzmus. So, and this is not, to me, this is not a minor point, because they're saying that what's the mila of mitzvahs is that's coming from this highest level. We're drawing it down when we do them. We're drawing it down into the world. But if it's an outward, it seems like it's more of it's an outward expression to some extent, because they're not God Himself. So I'm having a hard time understanding where you're saying that it's pneumius Atzmus, but also that
you understand when it comes to Torah, do you understand that Torah is Torah is one with God. It's Shashrim Lefanov. It's His innermost expression of God Himself, and that same Torah then travels downward and is manifest in words and letters and stories and details. Do you understand it with Torah, or are the questions only about mitzvahs? Or Torah, you have the same question?
That's a good question.
So the answer is very straightforward. Everything comes from Atzmus. Even a stone, even a leaf of a tree, everything comes from Atzmus. We learned at length the yichud of Atzmus, especially in the Teda Shalom at the end of Ayin Beis, that yichud is, from Atzmus' point of view, all of existence is just Atzmus. You remember that?
Yeah, of course, 100%.
Okay. And yet there's a world, and yet there's an existence, because Atzmus also has the power of concealment, and has the power to create something that will have its own independent consciousness. At the same time, from Atzmus' point of view, it's completely one with him. That's not even Mitzvos and Torah. I'm talking now even existence. That itself is hard to wrap our heads around, but that's why we have to learn Chassidus again and again. But that's what we discussed at length. And I would tell you, you probably, you need years to really internalize that. That's that. Then there are things that are not just God created existence, which is really one with Atzmus, that there are things that God actually implanted into existence, things that express Atzmus. So when it comes to Torah Mitzvos or Neshamas, now you're talking about not just a product of Atzmus that's really one with Atzmus, but you're actually talking about also something that expresses divine personality. When it comes to a tree or a stone, they all express a part of God's powers. But to express what God actually wants, like I said, you look at a building, you don't know what the intention of the building is until you open up a Torah. In Torah, God says, here's why I created the world. I created the world of the Lashamar. You should serve and protect. You should do mitzvahs. In what way? So basically, when it comes to Torah and mitzvahs, and the Shamar are the ones that are the ambassadors of the divine that implement it, they have the original source code. So the creation itself on its own would never be able to elevate itself to that place. So even though fundamentally all of existence is one with Atzmus, but the world cannot come to it on its own. So God gave us his blueprint. He gave us a part of himself. It says, Anon nafshi ksavis yavis, I have infused myself, embedded myself into Torah and into mitzvahs. And I embedded myself in a neshama, giving it a chelik elikam mal mamish, which is more than the divine energy in a tree or in a plant or in a mineral or in an animal. And I want you now to go into that world and reveal that ultimate total unity. So that's what we're talking about when we say Torah or mitzvahs. God is giving us his own, so-called his own tools. Now, how a mitzvah relates to Atzmus, that's what Hashem wanted. We'll never know why Hashem wanted tefillin and not some other mitzvah, not some other action. That's also part of what we learned in Torah Shalom. He said, "Mitzvahs misyachsis ala Atzmus," because they're essentially Atzmisdika tools, as opposed to the divine tools of creation, which we wouldn't call Atzmisdika tools. We would call them divine tools that God, like Chochmah, Bina, Das, and then even furthermore, Daimim, Tzemeach, Chaim, Medaber. So that's briefly part of it. I mean, as I said, this is a very comprehensive topic. I have talked about it quite a few times in maybe different language, but that's briefly the overview of it all.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful.
So even though the mitzvahs come down now, so the mitzvahs do come down as actual actions, like you give tzedakah, you're stretching your hand, you're going helping someone, but the root of that mitzvah has an atzmizdika power to it to actually transform the world. And when you do a different thing, let's say you chop wood, that's not a mitzvah. That it helps you get wood to be able to maybe build a Beis HaMikdash or build a home or use the wood to warm yourself and learn Torah by the warmth, but it's not a particular mitzvah. So mitzvahs have themselves a unique atzmizdika power, if you wish, to transform existence. So they come downward into existence. The mitzvahs, as they are by Hashem, is also not enough. The way Hashem puts on tefillin is not enough. He wants us to put on tefillin with our arm and our head and our shibud halev ha'mayach. However, when we do the mitzvah, we're drawing down from the mitzvah sov, or the Kedushas Atzmus that he's calling here, mamish.
Thank you.
So the whole purpose, so the Jews are connected then to this level so that we can help. I mean, obviously, I'm just restating this, but we're revealing this thing, and this is why we were given these tools. The whole purpose, like this whole idea of how you differentiate, what our job is in this world.
Yeah, we learned earlier why Shema Yisrael. Remember the emphasis, why the word Yisrael? So he said, because neshamas, if the king is going to send a messenger to transform the world, around him, he wants that messenger to have his power. He's not just going to send let's call it an external independent contractor. He's going to send something that has a piece of him. It's like sending his own son. Like he says in Tanya, the neshama has a chelik elikam ma'amam, so it's unique. It has a unique understanding of God, has a unique personality that is able to bring that godliness into existence. Now, the truth is, I pointed out many times, every human being was created in the divine image. So there's a sense, every person has a part of that power. Yisrael is a unique level, and that's another discussion, difference between Jews and non-Jews, but that's the power. And they use Torah and Mitzvos as the method. Torah is the blueprint, Mitzvos is the actionable items, the actionable actions that implement this this kavanah.
Right. That's the other connection so the Jews we have the obligation to, that's not just it, but I mean,
and non-Jews have the same, they have the obligation.
Yes, but we have more mitzvahs.
It's not a question of number. You're talking,
okay.
This is not a discussion about Jews and non-Jews here.
I'm sorry.
You could say all human beings have this power to do it to some extent.
Oh, they do. So they're all connected on that highest level of Atzmus that you're saying.
No, there's a difference, because then you still have to explain what's the difference between a Jew and non-Jew. That's not the scope of this.
All right. Sorry, Rabbi.
No, I'm saying the question is what you want to address. If you're asking me about the power, yes, the power of neshamas is rooted in those highest levels to be able to achieve this. I'm just saying, as an aside, you have to also explain how it is with non-Jews, but that's not really the discussion here.
Yes, I understand. That's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm going to stop here after the end of the brackets. So we learned a few lines on page 392.